Hello, everybody. Welcome back to 366 Days of Hope. My name is Pearl, and I'm here to share our next topic, which is self-reflection and how it can help resolve issues or problems and or avoid arguments in your relationship. So my husband and I, we were talking about what is a good, topic that we could cover regarding self-reflection, and he said, well, why don't you just talk to them about what sort of happened? And this is my guest, my husband. We decided to kind of bring it on and said, you know what? Yeah, because it's real life. It is something that happens multiple times in relationships where, you think about self-reflecting, being able to go through the conversations right then and there and be a willing reflector in the midst of a possible conflict, and how do you avoid that? So I'll have my husband and I kind of discuss this, but he'll introduce basically how we kind of got onto that topic.
So, I'm a head deacon at my church, and so I help out with a lot of different work that we're doing. And one of the things that we're doing is a youth event. And for the youth event, we have a number of different speakers, and myself included. So I had mentioned to my wife that a particular person I needed to contact them. You don't want to have two people preaching the same message. Just like any convention, you don't want two people saying the exact same thing. And so we need to get in touch and talk about exactly what we're going to be talking about. And so I had mentioned the person's name and said that they had been a guest speaker at our church just a few weeks ago. And how did you respond?
I pretty much said, no, that's not right. That's not the person who came a few weeks ago.
So I think understanding this initial response is going to make a huge difference in the overall topic of what it is that we're discussing. But we then dug in, looked at some of our church does a live stream. So we were able to see who was speaking at the church. And we were able to see specifically, our cats are making guest experience. We were able to see that this particular person actually did come to our church and speak just 3 weeks ago. So they did speak at our church 3 weeks ago, just recently. Pearl was thinking about the person who spoke the week before them. She actually missed the event 3 weeks ago at our church where this particular person was speaking. And so we almost got into an argument about the way that I responded and the way that she responded. Now, the missing part is how I responded. When Pearl told me that I was wrong, I told her, you can argue with this other church member because they're the one who referenced this person being at the church a few weeks ago. But I'm not going to allow you to argue with me. And that was way too harsh on my part. But we took the time to actually sit down and talk about it. So Pearl had begun to shut down because I had been too authoritarian in the discussion. And I was upset because she had said that I was wrong and I was correct. This is where self-reflection is really important. If it was more important to me to be right than for us to be right, then there's a problem. That's a lack of self-reflection. It was not more important for me to be right than to be right with my wife. And so we discussed it, and we talked about it. We very calmly. It's important to be emotionally calm, so if emotions have flared, take a break, give it a minute, come back to it. But we're not psychologists or therapists in any way, shape, or form, so take this advice simply as people who have been married for a very long time. So that comes with some amount of authority, but we are not clinical psychologists. The point being this: there was a lesson for us to learn. There's a lesson for me to learn and a lesson for my wife to learn from that experience. And the reality is that ultimately, if we didn't learn the lesson, God would steer us right around to the same conflict so that we could have that opportunity to learn that lesson. I like to make a reference to something that my parents told me, is that they had, my father, when he was young, prayed for patience. And so the Lord gave him 3 boys. So you have to be careful what you pray for. What is meant by this is that when we pray for things, or when we ask God for things, God isn't necessarily going to drop those things directly onto our doorstep. He may create a circumstance where we have the opportunity to develop those things in cooperation with Him. Because it's very different if statistically we know that people who win the lottery become poor almost immediately because they don't know how to handle the wealth. They also haven't earned it, so they don't have an intrinsic knowledge of what it's capable of. And so they make maybe foolish decisions, or they invest incorrectly, but they don't really value it. And so when God works with us to develop our character, it becomes something that's valuable to us, something that we've earned, and something that we know the purchase that took place to get it. So for this instance, we sat down and we talked, and it wasn't about me being right. It was about me being too harsh. But beyond my personal self-reflection, it's not my job to extract that self-reflection from Pearl. She has to be willing and want to do that herself. So a lot of times we think of this as a zero-sum game, where one person wins and therefore the other person loses. But if we're playing a team game, we want everybody to win as much as possible. That's why self-reflection is so important. In this case, it was my responsibility to set the example. As the husband, as the one who is in charge of my household, I need to set the example, even if Pearl doesn't follow it. So my part of this was to understand that I was being too harsh, and I was being a little too severe in my response to her telling me that I was wrong.
And I had to consider how I responded by immediately saying no, and recognize that I need to be a little bit more patient and considerate that maybe I don't know. Maybe I can't be too certain of a circumstance or situation, or I don't have all of the information. And so I think it's important that sometimes we need to know all the information before we make a judgment call on maybe whether we think we're right or wrong. And maybe be curious about it. Or instead of saying no, I could have responded by saying, you know what, I'm not certain, but maybe let's go back and check, because I'm not thinking of the same person. Maybe I have a different person in mind compared to who you are talking about. And so I sat there and had to kind of take it in as he was kind of sharing his thoughts. I sat there just listening. And I think that's the most important thing in your relationship, that when you're considering self-reflecting, you need to hear the other person out completely. And you need to kind of think, okay, well, is what they're saying have a point? And if it has a point, well, what is something that I can do to kind of change how the progression of this conversation takes place? Because I did sit there just very quiet, and my husband asked me, and I was like, okay, why am I feeling a little defeated? I had to kind of talk myself through mentally as to like what's going on in my mind, because as we talked about this, and I probably have said this before, when you're in a relationship, sometimes there are things in your past that affect your responses, and you have to unlearn those responses. Or maybe you're triggered by the way in which your spouse communicates with you, and you have to unlearn those communicative responses that you have. And so for me, my struggles were to just sort of freeze up, and I have kind of like this fight or flight. And so what I've had to learn is to, okay, I'm not freezing. I'm going to listen. I'm going to be active in this, but I need to figure out how to re-engage into the conversation. So when he asked me a question back, like, hey, are you doing okay? It's like I can respond back of, no, I'm not okay, or I don't know what I'm feeling right now, but I hear what you're saying, and I can understand that the things that you are saying are very important to you, but acknowledging the conversation as a whole. And right then and there, as we kind of talked about it and discussed it, we were able to basically resolve our situation in a very calm manner, and were able to diffuse the situation and help prevent the conflict basically to progress into something bigger that would have done really nothing for our evening. It would have just caused us to have been frustrated and would have ruined the atmosphere and the vibe in the room. I think it's important that when you're thinking about the other person and you're thinking, hey, I want to have a good relationship with this person's important to me, I do not want to have our relationship be something where we're combative at each other. We're a team. And so we work together to try to improve how we want to communicate and, importantly, like, reflect.
I think it's really important for us to understand us as a couple, to understand that one of the things that we're not trained well to do is to practice long-term strategies. With the internet age, I work in information technology, so networking, running Ethernet cables. And everybody wants everything right now. But we have a lot of clients who would prefer to put a Band-Aid on their networking problems, needing to replace a server or needing to reload a domain controller. They are preferring to put Band-Aids on situations that require severe first aid. In the relationship, what we did this evening to diffuse the situation was a long-term strategy, because it prevented a situation where a long-term problem could even, I hope I'm using the right word, metastasize. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to be thinking long-term. Is this a conflict that I want to extend over a couple days? Mm. But you have to remember that you're only one player. You can control what you do, but you can't and shouldn't control what your spouse does in that regard. Self-reflection allows you to demonstrate and to show and to lead by example, showing that you are thinking long-term. And ultimately, the person that you're with will appreciate that, because they will see that you care about the future. That you don't just live for the moment, but you're also thinking about what our relationship is going to look like in 5 months, 5 years down the line.
Absolutely. And I absolutely agree with that. But not only that, remember what we talk about, like, neuroplasticity. If you can learn a new way of communicating, or you're training yourself to not be reactive, or you're training yourself to respond in a much calmer way, or you're thinking of your spouse in a partnership instead of as an antagonist, that changes your brain pathways to help you be able to react again into the same similar situations the same way as you are. It's training you, basically your brain, to develop these new ways of coping and handing them down to the future generation, who, your kids are going to be watching how you interact. They're going to look at how does mom and dad solve problems, and you want to create and establish healthy reflections of conversations, and so that way it just benefits, your relationship.
But it's also there, if I can go back and talk about something you mentioned earlier, freezing up. Right. You can think about this as an opportunity to develop your own character, as well as respond in ways that relate to that neuroplasticity. Part of the understanding that my wife has a tendency to freeze up when she experiences sort of emotional conflict is an opportunity for me to understand that that is prey behavior. It's the behavior that immediately I think of like a deer in headlights. But our cats do that as well. When they're scared by a sound, they freeze. So that's actually an opportunity for me to demonstrate to my wife that I'm not a predator. That I'm not going to jump on her and take advantage of her weakness. And that behavior is not necessary, because it's an emergency strategy. So if we're able to diffuse it, understand that it's not an emergency, that response will become less and less necessary from her perceived reality, which also plays into the neuroplasticity. Understanding those things and those little nuances about your partner will make a huge difference in how you relate to them and how you can create an environment where those things can be done more efficiently.
Absolutely. Well, guys, I hope that blesses you and kind of encourages you in your own relationships and how you respond, and think about how you should be more reflective in your relationship to hopefully help in your conversation and in your communicative styles. With that said, guys, may you live, thrive, and be healthy, and see you guys next time. Bye! Thanks, hubby.
You're welcome.